The margins of this document contain notes written in a different handwriting, probably added years later by someone with more information. These notes confirm systematic poisoning, state that the water supply was contaminated with plant-based toxins, and estimate a maximum survival time of 6 days. Let's peel back the layers and reveal the truth about a secret Virginia has kept hidden for quite some time. To fully understand Nancy Green's terrible revenge, we must first look at the plantation where it started. This was a place where people were treated like test subjects, all in the name of scientific progress. In 1852, the Rappahannock River Valley was still a tobacco kingdom, though the talk in Richmond's exclusive clubs was starting to turn toward the sciences. Before the Confederate States were formed, Southern intellectuals were already exploring ideas about racial superiority, looking for a scientific basis to support their unique system. These men, educated in the best universities in the South, believed they could use modern scientific methods to prove their existing ideas about racial hierarchies. Amidst the prevailing pseudoscientific racism, Dr. Edmund Harwick took over his father's plantation, and what he did next was truly shocking. Harwick Plantation covered a vast 3,000 acres of Virginia's richest land, its fields tended by almost 200 enslaved individuals. The Harwick family had owned the property for 3 generations. Its origins rooted in the fortunes amassed through tobacco farming and the harsh realities of enslaved labor. To anyone arriving via the tree-lined drive, the estate presented a picture of Southern affluence. The white-columned mansion, bathed in the morning light, stood resplendent. Its wide verandas overlooked meticulously tended gardens. Beyond the main house, the quarters were arranged in tidy rows. Fields, stretching far into the distance, met the horizon, where the river's morning mist lingered. Yet, hidden beneath the surface of genteel plantation life, Dr. Harwick was running experiments that would have shocked even the most callous slave owner. The old tobacco barns, now repurposed, sat behind the main house. He referred to them as research facilities, and they were outfitted with cutting-edge scientific equipment. Chemical compounds, sourced from suppliers in Richmond and Baltimore, filled the space. From the street, these structures appeared unremarkable. Yet within their walls lay the framework for a level of human experimentation that wouldn't be matched until the most horrific periods of the 1900s. Nancy Green came to Harwick Plantation in the spring of 1850. She and her 3 sisters, Rebecca, Sarah, and Martha, were bought from a struggling tobacco farm in Alamance County, North Carolina. William Patterson, a planter on the brink of financial ruin, was desperate to sell. He considered his problematic stock enslaved women who, against the law, could read and write. Nancy, at 22, stood tall and composed, a testament to her years of hard work. Her eyes, sharp and observant, absorbed everything around her. Nancy was blissfully unaware that she and her sisters hadn't been bought for their farming abilities. The real reason for their purchase would soon become painfully clear, and in a manner that would chill her to the bone. Dr. Harwick, a Medical College of Virginia alumnus and a corresponding member of the American School of Anthropology, found himself captivated by Samuel Morton's work. Morton's contentious skull measurements, which purported to demonstrate the intellectual superiority of certain races, had drawn Harwick's attention. Morton's work seemed to provide a scientific basis for slavery, but Harwick wanted to expand on this idea. He was convinced that by manipulating breeding and environmental conditions, he could produce tangible proof of racial superiority. This, he thought, would provide a lasting justification for the Confederacy and finally put an end to the voices of Northern abolitionists. The Harwick family was a complex unit. Dr. Edmund Harwick, a man of 43, was driven by his scientific pursuits. His wife, Cordelia, a Charleston socialite, had fully adopted her husband's ideas about racial science. Their sons, Thomas and William, aged 17 and 15, had been raised to see enslaved individuals as mere subjects for examination. Margaret, their youngest, only 13, was already displaying unsettling traits of her family's callousness. Colonel Jeremiah Harwick, the patriarch, a War of 1812 veteran, financed his son's work. Captain James Harwick, Edmund's brother, managed the plantation and enforced the harsh discipline required to sustain the breeding program. To the outside world, they were respected members of Virginia society, regular attendees at Episcopal services, generous contributors to local charities, and gracious hosts to the political and social elite of the region. Nancy Green and her fellow enslaved people would become the architects of unimaginable suffering, committing acts that violated all standards of human decency in the name of scientific ideas that were as baseless as they were cruel. Nancy's first assignment placed her in the main house, and it wasn't long before Cordelia Harwick, the lady of the house, acknowledged her abilities. Nancy's proficiency in reading, writing, and herbal medicine, all of which she'd learned from her family who had been healers and midwives on North Carolina plantations for generations, gained her Cordelia's reluctant admiration. Nancy was unaware that Dr. Harwick was meticulously assessing her, documenting her intellect and physical traits in a leather-bound journal. This journal, filled with his observations, would eventually become crucial evidence of his wrongdoing. Unwittingly, she had become the primary subject in his elaborate scheme, a person distilled into a series of data points and observations, all for the sake of a twisted scientific pursuit. It was a sticky August morning in 1851 when Nancy first grasped the reality of her predicament. The Virginia summer swelter had draped itself across the plantation, a heavy, stifling weight. Morning brought with it the familiar, cloying aroma of tobacco, mingling with the pervasive, lingering stench of despair that clung to the slave quarters. Nancy's task was to bring the doctor his lunch. He was holed up in his study, a repurposed tobacco barn situated behind the main house. Lately, he'd been spending more and more time there, immersed in what he referred to as his research. As she neared the building, the silver tray she carried, heavy with cold chicken, biscuits, and sweet tea, seemed to vibrate with the energy of the voices inside, their tones sharp with argument. Dr. Harwick was in conference with a man of some standing from Richmond, and Nancy immediately recognized the voice. It was Dr. Samuel Cartwright, the physician whose controversial views on the mental capacities of African Americans had made him a well-known figure across the South. Cartwright was the physician who put forth the diagnosis of drapetomania, a supposed mental disorder that supposedly drove slaves to escape, and dysesthesia ethiopica, which he believed explained the perceived laziness and disobedience of enslaved people. Nancy lingered near the entrance, pretending to rearrange the contents of her tray. In truth, she was straining to catch the words drifting from inside. Peering through a gap in the wooden planks, she caught sight of the two men. They were bent over a sprawling table, which was cluttered with charts, intricate diagrams, and what looked like meticulous measurements. The barn's interior, now a laboratory, was a study in organized chaos. Glass bottles, each holding a different liquid, lined the shelves. Nancy couldn't identify the scientific instruments scattered about, and the leather-bound journals, stacked high, chronicled years of observations and experiments. Peering through the fissure, Nancy saw a discussion unfold, one that would stay with her, a specter, forever. The two men pored over intricate charts and data, their conversation a clinical dissection of breeding schedules and selection standards. It was a discussion that could have been mistaken for the mating of animals, not the shaping of human destinies. Dr. Cartwright's theory suggested that certain combinations of African tribal heritages would produce children with specific physical and mental traits. These traits, he believed, could be studied and documented to provide clear proof of racial hierarchies. The female specimens you've chosen exhibit remarkable cranial capacity for their demographic, Dr. Cartwright stated, gesturing toward a chart. Nancy's name was prominently displayed at the top, accompanied by a series of precise measurements and observations. The Nancy subject shows concerning signs of intelligence, and we must work to lessen this in her children. We cannot allow these unusual traits to spread, as they go against our basic ideas about racial ability. Furthermore, they could be used by those who want to end slavery to challenge our scientific findings. Dr. Harwick's head bobbed in agreement, his enthusiasm palpable as he leaned closer to the charts. I've selected the appropriate male candidates, as you requested. The breeding program is set to begin this month. I've also set up the necessary facilities, which will give us full control over the environment throughout gestation and the initial stages of development. Naturally, any offspring that don't meet our standards will be handled according to our usual procedures. Nancy felt a chill, a visceral reaction. as she understood they were talking about her and her sisters like they were cattle. The dread intensified when Dr. Cartwright, with a practiced hand, unfastened a leather satchel. He then produced several glass vials, each holding a different chemical concoction. The liquids varied in hue, from crystal clear to a rich amber, and then to a deep, unsettling red. Each vial bore a label, a jumble of scientific symbols and numbers that Nancy couldn't begin to understand, yet they filled her with a primal sense of foreboding. "These solutions have worked wonders at our Richmond facility," Dr. Cartwright said, gesturing with a vial of clear liquid that sparkled in the sunlight, filtering through the barn's lone window. "If pregnant women drink a small amount of this substance, it often leads to natural abortions if the fetus shows undesirable traits. The muriatic acid solution is especially useful for identifying individuals with either high intelligence or rebellious behavior. A few drops applied to the eyes will cause permanent blindness, but the person will still be alive to serve as a warning to others." Nancy's heart raced as she observed Dr. Harwick meticulously recording the correct dosages and methods for administering the chemical solutions. The realization hit her like a punch. Muriatic acid, she discovered, was employed to sear identifying marks onto the skin of troublesome slaves. In stronger solutions, it could also blind someone for good. Even more disturbing was the casual discussion of infanticide, the systematic killing of infants who didn't meet the requirements of the experiments. This was hidden behind the idea of natural death and justified by twisted scientific theories. The meeting wrapped up with Dr. Cartwright presenting a hefty envelope. It looked like it contained official government papers, sealed with wax and adorned with stamps that, from her vantage point, Nancy couldn't decipher. "The Confederate Scientific Commission is most pleased with your preliminary results," he stated, his tone laced with the weight of official approval. "Proceed with the breeding program as detailed in these papers, and keep this under wraps. The work we're doing here will provide the scientific basis for our cause when the inevitable conflict with the North begins. The evidence we gather will prove beyond doubt that the Negro race is incapable of self-governance and that slavery is not just economically necessary but morally justified." Nancy hurried back to her room, her thoughts a whirlwind after what she'd just heard. That evening, as they squeezed into the small cabin they'd been assigned, she revealed her findings to her sisters. Slowly, they started to grasp the enormity of their situation. These individuals were not merely enslaved agricultural workers. Rather, they were unwitting participants in a breeding program. This program aimed to generate scientific proof of racial inferiority, which would subsequently be employed to legitimize the enslavement of their descendants for an extended period. In the weeks that followed, Nancy looked at the plantation differently, her gaze sharpening to the subtleties she'd missed before. Some enslaved women received special diets, packed with nutrients that were unavailable to others. They also lived in separate quarters, which had been upgraded with improved ventilation and cleaner living conditions. Male slaves underwent physical examinations and measurements that were completely unrelated to their actual duties. The most unsettling thing, though, was seeing several women fresh from childbirth without their babies. When they asked about their children, the answers were always the same: something about weakness, natural selection, or God's will. The words felt empty, especially now that Nancy understood the reality of Dr. Harwick's work. The grim reality of Dr. Harwick's breeding program took hold in the autumn of 1851. The Virginia landscape, ablaze with vibrant reds and golds, provided a jarring backdrop to the deepening shadows enveloping the enslaved people on Harwick Plantation. Nancy and her sisters were relocated to a specific area within the slave quarters. Dr. Harwick, with a certain irony, referred to it as the research facility. Everyone knew, however, that it was just a more regimented kind of confinement, intended to aid his experiments. The old tobacco warehouse had been repurposed, its interior now a series of individual cells. Each cell measured roughly 8 by 10 feet, furnished with little more than a cot, a wash basin, and a small window. That window, however, was secured with iron bars, a precaution against any attempts to flee. The walls absorbed noise, creating a hushed environment, while the doors were fortified with substantial locks, accessible solely from the exterior. Each cell was assigned a number, and detailed charts were displayed outside each door. These charts recorded the occupants' physical characteristics, breeding schedule, and current experimental status. Nancy was the initial subject of the breeding protocol, matched with a man named Samuel. He'd been acquired expressly for Dr. Harwick's program. Samuel, a field hand from a Henrico County plantation, had been chosen. Dr. Harwick's notes labeled him a superior physical specimen with diminished cranial capacity. Essentially, his physical prowess was prized, while his intellect was seen as a hindrance, something to be eliminated from the gene pool. Samuel, a man of considerable stature, possessed a gentle spirit. He, like Nancy, had been deeply unsettled by the revelation of their coerced marriage's actual intent. Dr. Harwick, in his usual clinical manner, outlined the breeding protocol. Samuel and Nancy grasped the implications immediately. Defiance meant severe punishment, perhaps even death. Yet, they also knew that submission offered no assurance of their children's survival. The conditions of their confinement were carefully controlled, following protocols that Dr. Harwick developed through discussions with other researchers in the South. Their diet was carefully watched, and they were given different substances that Dr. Harwick said would affect how their babies developed. However, Nancy suspected these supplements were actually experimental drugs, and their effects were being studied. The subjects were required to undergo weekly medical assessments, during which Dr. Harwick would evaluate multiple facets of their physical growth, procure blood specimens, and meticulously document their physical and psychological conditions within the ubiquitous leather-bound journals. The real nightmare, however, unfolded when Nancy's sister Rebecca found herself expecting a child with her designated partner, a reserved man named Joshua. He, like Samuel, had been chosen for comparable reasons. Dr. Harwick's enthusiasm was evident. He observed Rebecca's pregnancy with a level of scrutiny that was unusual. Making a point to visit her cell every day, he measured her growing abdomen, tested her reflexes, and put her through a series of procedures. He insisted these were essential for the baby's well-being, though they often felt more like data collection than genuine medical attention. When Rebecca's son arrived, a healthy baby, in the spring of 1852, Nancy's first emotion was a wave of relief. Maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind them. Perhaps the child would be allowed to thrive, to experience a normal life within the confines of their world. The labor had been long, a grueling ordeal that stretched close to 20 hours. Yet, Rebecca had borne it with the quiet resilience that seemed to run in their bloodline. The baby, however, seemed utterly fine, perfectly healthy and whole. The moment of respite was fleeting. Before Rebecca had a chance to catch her breath after the birth, Dr. Harwick and his son Thomas appeared. They brought with them a collection of measuring devices and immediately began a battery of tests on the newborn, each one more invasive than the last. Nancy's stomach churned as she observed the scene unfolding in the cell next door. They were measuring the baby's head meticulously, with calipers and other instruments, from every possible angle. His reflexes were tested using sharp tools, and his physical characteristics were carefully recorded in a separate leather-bound book specifically designed for assessing the experimental subjects. The ordeal dragged on for 3 days. The infant endured treatments that, even by the medical standards of the era, would have been deemed cruel. Dr. Harwick used calipers to measure the infant's skull very precisely, recording the exact sizes of facial features. He also observed how the infant reacted to different things, and wrote down detailed notes about what he called cognitive indicators and behavioral anomalies, which he claimed were only noticeable to him. After 3 days of careful observation and measurement, Dr. Harwick presented his conclusion, using the same objective scientific language he would use for any other lab result. The child's case presented excessive head growth, unusual reactions to visual stimuli, and concerning signs of cognitive advancement, which contradicted the author's views on the intellectual limitations of people of African descent. In his flawed reasoning, these characteristics were seen as undesirable, making the child unsuitable for his research and a potential threat to the main goals of the breeding program. The baby, he stated, his voice devoid of warmth, was a scientific aberration. It had to be removed, he insisted, to maintain the purity of the experiment's findings. The child's intelligence, rather than being celebrated as a sign of human potential, was seen as a threat to the racist ideas that the breeding program was designed to support. That night, the research facility was filled with the sound of Rebecca's screams. They were desperate, echoing endlessly, until they finally faded into the sound of a mother's grief, the heart-wrenching sobs of a woman who had lost her child. Morning light filtered through the bars, and Rebecca remained in her cell, a shattered figure. She gazed blankly, her eyes devoid of life, her arms wrapped around nothing, the absence of her child, a physical ache. When Nancy inquired about the baby's fate, Dr. Harwick offered a clinical explanation. The child, he said, had been born with inherent frailty and hadn't made it through the night. However, his manner hinted at a more sinister involvement in the child's demise. Nancy, however, had noticed the small vial of transparent liquid that Dr. Harwick had brought into Rebecca's cell the previous evening. She immediately identified it as the very same substance Dr. Cartwright had showcased during their meeting months prior. Rebecca's child hadn't simply passed away. He'd been killed, a victim of Dr. Harwick's twisted scientific pursuits. The baby's remarkable intellect was the problem, a direct challenge to the racist beliefs underpinning the breeding program, and it had cost him his life. Nancy's chance to gather intelligence arrived courtesy of her ongoing duty to tidy Dr. Harwick's study. This chore, initially assigned due to her reading skills and meticulous nature, now offered her an unparalleled view of the papers and items that would become vital to her scheme of retribution. The old tobacco barn, now a makeshift lab, would have wowed even the most discerning medical students from Richmond or Baltimore. Glass bottles, filled with all sorts of chemical concoctions, lined the shelves. Detailed charts documented the progress of his breeding experiments. Nancy was starting to grasp the scale of it all, a sprawling network of similar operations, connected by a web of correspondence, stretched across the South. As she went about her cleaning, a task she undertook with scrupulous attention, all the while committing the lab's every detail to memory, Nancy meticulously recorded the whereabouts and contents of each chemical container. She became adept at spotting the muriatic acid bottles, their telltale amber hue and the faint, persistent odor they gave off, even when the caps were screwed on tight. The doctor kept the clear liquid in smaller containers, all neatly arranged near his desk. Each vessel bore a label, a string of scientific symbols that Nancy slowly began to understand. She figured them out by watching closely and thinking things through. More significantly, she stumbled upon Dr. Harwick's extensive journal collection. These leather-bound volumes held more than just notes on his experiments. They included meticulous instructions for concocting and using different chemical solutions, letters exchanged with colleagues across the area, and, most damningly, a precise account of every infant murder carried out under the guise of scientific inquiry. The journals laid bare the complete extent of the nightmare, a darkness that stretched well beyond the boundaries of Harwick Plantation. Dr. Harwick wasn't a lone wolf. He was embedded in a tightly knit web of plantation owners and doctors, all of whom were running comparable breeding programs across Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. The goal was to create scientific evidence that would support the Confederacy's claims of racial superiority as the conflict with the North began. This would provide an intellectual basis for slavery, countering the abolitionists' arguments about human equality. Nancy's reading revealed accounts of the methodical killing of numerous infants. These babies, it seemed, had been deemed unworthy of life due to traits like superior intelligence, impressive physical abilities, or even a heightened capacity for emotional connection. She discovered the clear liquid was a potent concoction of plant-derived poisons. It contained extracts from pokeweed, oleander, and castor beans. These substances could kill within a matter of hours. Moreover, they left no readily apparent traces of foul play, which meant no immediate alarm would be raised, either by the authorities or among the enslaved population. The muriatic acid, as it turned out, was employed for branding slaves. However, Nancy learned that Dr. Harwick had been tinkering with various concentrations and methods. He was refining techniques capable of inflicting a range of injuries, from minor burns to lasting scars, even total blindness, contingent on the precise mixture and how it was applied. His notes included detailed observations about how different chemical combinations worked, recorded with the same precision a researcher would use when documenting the results of medical treatments. The most telling detail came from a recent letter penned by Dr. Cartwright. He lauded Dr. Harwick's novel methods for managing subjects, singling out his achievement in eradicating cognitive anomalies within the experimental group. The correspondence also detailed a formula for a novel chemical. This compound was designed to induce irreversible blindness in individuals deemed to possess excessive visual intelligence. This, they defined as the capacity to read and understand their environment in ways that jeopardize the operation's secrecy. The substance, a carefully made mixture of strong lye and hydrochloric acid, was designed to destroy the corneas and optic nerves. This was done while keeping the victim alive, serving both as a punishment and a warning to others who might resist. Dr. Cartwright's letter included detailed instructions for preparing and using the substance. It specified that the substance should be given as eye drops, and the subject should be physically restrained to ensure the substance fully contacted the eye. Nancy's eyes widened as she absorbed the instructions, a mix of dread and fury swelling within her. A dark scheme took shape, fueled by the very substances Dr. Harwick had devised to blind the defiant. She realized these same chemicals could be repurposed, wielded against those who had conceived them, with potentially catastrophic results. Nancy's scheme, however, was about more than just payback. She aimed to dismantle the whole system of experimental plantations, determined to prevent any other families from enduring the same fate as hers. She was prepared to give everything, even her own life, to see it through. Nancy started a covert operation, meticulously recording every detail she could uncover in Dr. Harwick's study. She used her reading and writing abilities to transcribe vital information onto bits of paper, which she then concealed all over the plantation. She committed to memory the names and whereabouts of the other plantations involved, painstakingly transcribed letters that implicated government figures and well-known residents, and, crucially, mastered the precise recipes and uses of every chemical in the doctor's vast collection. Nancy's pregnancy was nearing its conclusion, and she felt an increasing sense of urgency as her due date approached. Her child was due soon, and then the baby would face Dr. Harwick's assessment. If the infant displayed any signs of intelligence or physical growth that clashed with the doctor's beliefs, the child would be killed, just as her sister's children had been. The knowledge that her unborn child could be dead within days consumed her, a desperate rage that intensified daily. It became the fire that drove her, the thing that made her certain the Harwick family would face justice. Nancy's discovery in the doctor's files, however, added a new layer of urgency to her task. She'd found proof that the breeding program was on the verge of a significant expansion. Dr. Harwick, with backing and funds from Confederate supporters in Richmond, was set to expand his work. The plan was to grow his operation from 200 subjects to more than 1,000, effectively transforming Harwick Plantation into the South's most extensive experimental facility. As new buildings went up on nearby properties, more research subjects were being bought from slave markets across the region. The goal was to create a complete database of racial traits to support the political arguments of the Confederacy. The nightmare Nancy and her family had lived through was poised to repeat itself, this time affecting hundreds of unsuspecting individuals. The calculated slaughter of children, which had already taken her nephews, was on the verge of becoming a mass operation. The time for careful planning and patient observation had passed. Direct action was now necessary, regardless of the personal cost or the likelihood of survival. Nancy's daughter arrived on a frigid February morning in 1853. Sarah, Nancy's sister, was the one who brought her into the world, right there in their cell. A fierce winter storm was battering the research facility at the time. The work was grueling, a night-long ordeal. The wind screamed around the old tobacco barn, now repurposed, and ice crept across the barred windows. But when the sun finally rose, Nancy cradled a flawless baby, vibrant and aware, already hinting at the brilliance that would ultimately seal her fate under Dr. Harwick's judgment. The baby was lovely, as all newborns are. Yet Nancy could already see in her daughter's sparkling eyes and eager movements the very traits that Dr. Harwick would later deem concerning. The girl's keen perception, her seeming grasp of the world around her, and her vigorous reactions to what she encountered were precisely the traits that had sealed her cousin's fates, all in the name of scientific inquiry. Nancy cradled her daughter for a fleeting 18 hours, etching the contours of her face into her memory, attempting to distill a mother's love into those precious, ephemeral moments. Then, Dr. Harwick appeared, bringing with him the tools of his trade and the protocols of assessment. The doctor arrived at last, his sons, Thomas and William, in tow. They'd been groomed to help with these assessments. Nancy's heart sank as she prepared to surrender her child to the man who would likely condemn her. The examination was a grueling ordeal, a process that mirrored Dr. Harwick's meticulous approach to his scientific work. Using calipers and other tools, he carefully measured the baby's physical development. He then tested her reflexes with sharp instruments and carefully observed how she reacted to different things, while he told Thomas what he saw. Thomas wrote everything down in another leather-bound journal, which was specifically for recording the traits of the experimental babies. After what felt like an eternity of examination, Dr. Harwick finally concluded his assessment, the results of which were, unsurprisingly, grim. The child showed unusual head growth, an unusual reaction to visual stimuli, and signs of cognitive development that went against his ideas about the differences in intelligence between different races. In his clinical notes, which he dictated while Nancy listened, he described the infant as a significant deviation from expected racial norms and unsuitable for the continuation of the experimental bloodline. The execution was set for the next day, and the same plant-derived poisons that had taken Nancy's nephews would be used. Dr. Harwick, maintaining the same clinical detachment he would use in any other lab procedure, explained that the child would receive a carefully measured dose of the poison. This would cause the organs to fail quickly, making it look like a natural cause. The baby's death would be logged as infant mortality, a routine event that wouldn't raise any eyebrows. The body would then be handled, like the others that didn't make it, buried in an unmarked grave somewhere out of sight on the plantation, far from prying eyes and questions. That evening, with her condemned daughter cradled in her arms, Nancy listened to the rhythmic sound of her breathing, and the plan she'd been secretly crafting for months reached its conclusion. She'd already pinpointed the whereabouts of every chemical in Dr. Harwick's lab, committed to memory the daily schedules of each family member, and assembled the instruments required to carry out her vengeance with ruthless efficiency. This wouldn't be a straightforward act of revenge, born solely from a mother's fury, even if that fury undeniably stoked her resolve. Nancy's plan was to blow the whistle on the whole breeding operation. She wanted to make sure that proof of Dr. Harwick's wrongdoings found its way to the right people, those in power who might actually do something about it, even if they were a rare breed in the slave-holding South. She knew of several well-known abolitionists in Richmond and Washington, individuals who would be appalled by the widespread infanticide occurring on Virginia plantations. She held on to the hope that if she could endure long enough to share this information with them, maybe other families could be spared the anguish that had shattered her own. Nancy's plan required precise timing and a level of composure that would have impressed military strategists. Simultaneously, she would have to eliminate every Harwick family member involved in the breeding program, whether they knew about it or were directly involved. She also needed to secure and preserve evidence of their crimes, making sure it would eventually be discovered by outside authorities. Finally, she had to create a situation that would force an investigation by officials who might otherwise ignore the abuses committed against enslaved people. The chemical agents that Dr. Harwick had originally planned to use for torture and murder would instead be used as tools of justice, administered with the same clinical precision he had used in his experiments. Nancy's vengeance wouldn't be swift, nor would it be easy. She planned to make the Harwick family endure the same drawn-out agony they'd forced upon others. She wanted them to truly grasp the sensation of powerlessness, of being judged and sentenced by someone who considered them beneath her. At the stroke of midnight, with the tempest still howling, Nancy pressed a last kiss to her daughter's forehead and carefully handed her over to Sarah. "Whatever comes, promise me you'll keep her safe," she murmured to her sister, her words almost lost in the howling wind. "Get her out of here, if you can. Tell her mother died battling monsters, and that she must never let anyone convince her she's less than everything. She's worth more than all their calculations and assessments put together." Nancy eased out of her cell, a skill she'd mastered ages ago. She'd figured out how to pick the lock on the research facility door, a feat accomplished through keen observation and a lot of trial and error. The plantation lay still, the Virginia night punctuated only by the familiar sounds of the countryside, now overlaid with the storm's wrath. Even the guard dogs, familiar with her scent, ignored her as she approached the main house and the laboratory. There, the instruments of her vengeance awaited, neatly arranged in their labeled bottles. The laboratory door, a fortress in its own right, was secured by a hefty padlock, a deterrent for all but the most determined. Nancy, however, had seen Dr. Harwick unlock it countless times while she cleaned, and she had committed every nuance of the ritual to memory. The key, as she'd anticipated, was tucked away in a tiny wooden box under his desk. She'd known it would be there, swaddled in oiled cloth to ward off dampness, and placed just so, ensuring its disappearance wouldn't raise an immediate alarm. Within seconds, she stood within the repurposed tobacco barn, the very place that had been the epicenter of so much pain. She was surrounded by the tools and substances that had facilitated the methodical killing of children, innocent lives snuffed out. The lab, post-storm, was unsettlingly still. The wind whispered through the wooden structure, and the building itself groaned as it adjusted to the chill. The chemical compounds were precisely where she'd left them, a mirror of the countless hours she'd spent observing and scrubbing. The lye solution, a potent mix, occupied a large glass container on the top shelf. Dr. Harwick's meticulous handwriting marked the label, a clear indication of its contents. The container was stored precisely as the safety protocols dictated, protocols he'd absorbed from his exchanges with fellow researchers. The muriatic acid, kept in smaller bottles, was located near the doctor's desk. Each bottle was meticulously sealed and marked with the date of its preparation. Nancy meticulously measured each compound, adhering to the mixing instructions she'd committed to memory from Dr. Cartwright's letters. She approached the task with the same level of precision that Dr. Harwick himself would have demanded. The undertaking was perilous. The chemicals released noxious vapors upon mixing. Yet, Nancy had watched the doctor work closely enough to grasp the essential safety measures. The resulting solution was a clear, odorless liquid that, when it touched human eyes, would cause immediate and permanent blindness. Nancy's scheme demanded more than a simple blinding agent. She had to make sure the Harwick family lived long enough to face the music, to feel the weight of what they'd done. And she needed to guarantee that the proof of their wrongdoing was kept safe, ready for the authorities when the inevitable inquiry got underway. Nancy meticulously filled 7 tiny glass vials with the blinding solution, 1 for each member of the Harwick family. She used the very same precision instruments that Dr. Harwick had employed to measure chemicals for his experiments. Additionally, she collected several bottles containing other chemicals used in Dr. Harwick's research. These included the plant-based toxins that had caused the infants' deaths, as well as various marking solutions used to identify the experimental subjects. The crux of Nancy's scheme, however, hinged on Dr. Harwick's extensive documentation. The journal was a meticulous record, chronicling each killing, every experiment conducted, and all the letters exchanged with his associates across the southern states. If these records are kept safe and given to the right people, they could reveal the entire network of breeding facilities. This would help stop future abuses done in the name of scientific research. Nancy took great care to wrap the journal and its accompanying papers in oiled cloth. She then concealed them in several places, ensuring they'd be found by those looking for them, yet shielded from the weather until that moment. She meticulously crafted a confession, her own handwriting betraying no haste. In it, she laid bare her deeds, offering a precise account of the offenses at Harwick Plantation. She named names, detailing the individuals who had aided her across the area, and pinpointed the whereabouts of crucial evidence that would substantiate her claims. The house was utterly still as Nancy moved through it, a ghost in her own home. She glided from room to room, her movements a study in the practiced art of remaining unseen, a skill honed over countless years. The Harwick family, blissfully unaware, slumbered in their cozy beds. Little did they know, their prey had transformed into their judge, jury, and executioner. Their comfortable existence, built on a foundation of scientific racism, was on the brink of a catastrophic collapse, one that would be both literal and excruciating. Nancy's initial focus was Dr. Harwick, the very man who had conceived the breeding program. He was the one who had coldly taken her nephew's lives and intended to do the same to her daughter, all in the name of advancing science. She discovered him in his study, slumbering amidst the books and documents that had offered the flimsy, pseudo-scientific rationale for his actions. His face, even in repose, seemed untouched by the atrocities he'd perpetrated. Nancy lingered, gazing down at the man lost in slumber, the first vial of the blinding solution clutched in her hand. She thought of the children, the countless lives snuffed out by his warped ideas. She murmured a prayer, a quiet plea for her deceased nephews, for her daughter facing execution, and for the countless others who had suffered under the breeding program. Then, with the same meticulousness Dr. Harwick had employed in his work, she administered the chemical drops to his closed eyes. Dr. Harwick's screams, a piercing wail as the acid seared his eyes, echoed through the house, rousing everyone. Nancy, however, had foreseen this. She capitalized on the ensuing chaos and fear. As the family groped through the shadows, struggling to comprehend their father's fate, the cacophony of fear and bewilderment that echoed within the walls was a melody to Nancy. It was a symphony of retribution, a long-awaited performance finally underway. Nancy methodically applied the blinding agent to every Harwick, her movements precise as she navigated the house. The family, disoriented and in agony, stumbled around in the pitch black. Thomas and William, the teenage sons who'd helped their father with his experiments and measurements, got their doses while still groggy and bewildered by the sudden upheaval. Margaret, the daughter, had observed the newborn evaluations with a dispassionate gaze, mirroring the adults around her. She was then blinded in a desperate attempt to reach her parents. Colonel Jeremiah Harwick, the old man who'd bankrolled his son's work and given him the land, got his shot while fumbling with an antique military pistol. His hands, trembling with age and fear, struggled to load the weapon. Captain James Harwick, the man who'd run the breeding program and dealt with the dead infants, lost his sight. He was trying to rally a defense against what he thought was an uprising by the enslaved. Mrs. Cordelia Harwick was the last person on Nancy's list, and as she prepared the blinding solution, she offered a thorough account of the reasons behind the impending justice. Nancy hoped Cordelia would grasp, in those last fleeting seconds of vision, that her blindness was the price for every child lost to her family's perverse scientific pursuits. It was a life of ease, built on the very bedrock of calculated infanticide. Nancy's vengeance, however, didn't stop with the Harwick family's blinding. That was merely the opening act in a carefully orchestrated plan of retribution designed to bring about their prolonged and excruciating demise. Their cries reverberated within the walls of the main house, and they floundered through rooms now foreign to them, colliding with furniture and pleading for assistance that was, of course, futile. Meanwhile, Nancy was executing the second phase of her scheme, a methodical poisoning designed to guarantee their protracted and painful demise, all while keeping them alive just long enough to witness the repercussions of their deeds. The plantation's water source was a deep well, situated behind the main house. This well, hand-dug by enslaved laborers long ago, was lined with stones. These stones had been meticulously arranged to keep the water clean. Nancy had, for some time, recognized this as the most effective way to administer the plant-based poisons Dr. Harwick had employed to kill infants. Each sip of water the family took would seal their fate. Nancy meticulously prepared the doses, each one a blend of the toxins she'd pilfered from Dr. Harwick's lab. She worked with the same precision the doctor had, recalling the exact formulations from his journal, the words etched in her memory. The resulting mixture included pokeweed extracts, which would cause organs to fail over time, oleander components, which would harm the cardiovascular system, and castor bean derivatives, which would lead to liver and kidney damage within a few days. The toxins were designed to cause organs to fail slowly over several days. This allowed symptoms to develop and the victims to understand what was happening to them. Unlike the quick deaths of the murdered infants, the Harwick family would experience a long period of suffering. This would give them a chance to consider their actions and understand the justice of their punishment. Nancy emptied the vial into the well, making certain that every single drop of water the Harwick family drank would seal their fate. The poisons were invisible and almost flavorless, crafted to evade detection until the damage was done, beyond the reach of any remedy, even if one had existed in rural Virginia back in 1853. Nancy's scheme, however, reached further than her immediate kin. It encompassed the overseers and guards, those who had not only enforced the breeding program but also took part in the calculated killings of the children. She understood that some of these men were fathers, husbands, with children who had nothing to do with the wrongs done at Harwick Plantation. She wouldn't hurt those who weren't culpable. In contrast, the adults who participated in the breeding program or who were aware of the infanticide deserved the same consequences as their superiors. The overseers' quarters, a tidy row of modest structures, sat close to the main house. These buildings were home to the white employees who managed the plantation's day-to-day activities. Nancy made her rounds, slipping through the buildings one by one. The pre-dawn hours were still, the occupants blissfully unaware of the reckoning that was about to unfold. Ferguson, the chief overseer, the man who'd physically held infants during Dr. Harwick's assessments, got a complete dose of the blinding solution while he was asleep. Nancy had seen this man restrain infants in distress while Dr. Harwick delivered fatal doses, and she felt no pity as she poured the acid that would blind him. The stable master, a man who'd assisted in the grim task of burying murdered children in the plantation's hidden graves, was also struck blind. He got his dose while attempting to get up from his bed, drawn by the screams emanating from the main house. Nancy approached the task with a systematic, no-nonsense attitude, meticulously interviewing everyone on the plantation who had any involvement, however indirect, with the breeding program. The plantation's clerk, responsible for keeping tabs on the experimental subjects and their breeding cycles, was rendered sightless in his office. He was attempting to make sense of the uproar that had erupted outside. The doctor's assistant, a young man from Richmond who'd assisted with medical exams and chemical preparations, got his dose as he tried to escape the plantation, clearly in a state of panic. By the time the sun rose, 9 people were permanently blind, and the water supply was poisoned with deadly chemicals. Nancy had achieved her main goals with a methodical approach. She made sure those behind the breeding program would face severe consequences for their actions. Simultaneously, she safeguarded the evidence needed to reveal the full extent of the experimental plantations. With the dawn breaking over Harwick Plantation, the sun's rays stretched out, painting the tobacco fields in a golden hue and signaling a hard-won victory. Nancy made her way back to the research facility, where her daughter and sisters were waiting. She understood the authorities would soon catch up with her, and that her own demise was a foregone conclusion. Yet, she'd achieved every single thing she'd aimed for. The Harwick family would face a drawn-out, agonizing demise, a mere echo of the torment they'd dealt out. But the real victory lay elsewhere. The truth of their actions would come to light, and the breeding program they'd orchestrated would be laid bare for all to see. Nancy devoted her last hours of freedom to composing lengthy letters. She addressed them to abolitionists in Richmond and Washington, meticulously detailing the whereabouts of Dr. Harwick's records. She also included precise information about other plantations where comparable experiments were being conducted. She penned a detailed confession, laying bare her actions and the reasons behind them. Her aim was to guarantee that anyone looking into the matter later would grasp the complete extent of the atrocities committed at Harwick Plantation and the extreme steps she'd felt compelled to take to bring them to an end. The letters, carefully concealed, were stashed in different spots across the plantation. Each was wrapped in oiled cloth, a deliberate choice, and tucked away where they'd eventually be found, as the ensuing investigation would surely reveal. Nancy meticulously crafted instructions for her sisters, a code she'd imparted to them in those last tense moments. These instructions detailed how to find and present the evidence, should any of them manage to endure the inevitable retribution. The initial indication that trouble was brewing at Harwick Plantation surfaced when Dr. Edmund Harwick didn't show up for a meeting with Richmond officials on the 15th of March, 1853. Harwick's absence from the meeting was a shock. He was supposed to present his latest research to a committee of Confederate sympathizers. They wanted to use his work to bolster their claims about racial inferiority. Missing such an important gathering was completely unlike him. He'd built his reputation on being reliable and always showing up on time. Dr. Samuel Cartwright, Harwick's associate, and two influential Richmond businessmen, the financial backers of the breeding program, arrived at the plantation for the meeting. What they discovered would stay with them, a permanent mark on their memories. The Harwick family, now bereft of sight, filled the main house with their anguished cries. They stumbled through rooms they could no longer find their way around, their bodies ravaged by a slow, internal poisoning that was swiftly shutting down their vital organs. Dr. Cartwright's first thought was that an industrial mishap was to blame. Maybe it was something to do with the chemicals used in tobacco processing, or perhaps the water supply had been tainted by something in nature. As he examined the victims, his clinical expertise, the very skills that had earned him respect across the South, came into play. It was then he realized their injuries were far too deliberate, too methodical, to be anything but intentional. The similar pattern of blindness seen in all the victims suggests that a carefully made chemical solution was used, rather than exposure to industrial pollutants. The symptoms of poisoning indicated ongoing exposure to several plant-based toxins. Preparing and administering these toxins effectively would have required extensive knowledge of both chemistry and botany. Each member of the Harwick family was deliberately given a carefully prepared blinding solution, and the plantation's water supply was systematically poisoned with substances that caused gradual organ failure. The careful planning and precise execution of the attack suggested a level of education and scientific knowledge that contradicted the common belief about the abilities of enslaved people. The subsequent inquiry laid bare the extent of Nancy's retribution, and, crucially, the methodical killing of infants that had sparked it. Dr. Cartwright, even though he'd played a role in the breeding program and had been the architect of the very theories that had made it possible, was truly appalled by the evidence of mass murder that Nancy's actions had laid bare. Dr. Harwick's meticulous lab notes revealed a level of scientific inquiry that would have been hard to defend, even for the most devoted supporters of the Confederacy. The cold-blooded killing of babies, the exploitation of enslaved individuals for twisted experiments, and the web of cooperation with other Southern facilities exposed a degree of calculated brutality that appalled even those who had dedicated their lives to upholding the system of slavery. Richmond's local authorities were called in, though their inquiry was instantly hampered by the case's political ramifications. The breeding program, a project that had drawn in influential families across Virginia, found backing from Confederate officials. They hoped to leverage the research to bolster their arguments for secession and the spread of slavery into uncharted lands. The investigation, if it went too far, risked revealing a web of cooperation that reached into the upper echelons of Southern society. Such a revelation could have seriously weakened backing for the Confederate effort, potentially before it even got off the ground. Nancy was found in the research facility, a picture of serene composure. She sat with her infant daughter and her sisters, resigned to whatever fate awaited them. Under questioning regarding the Harwick family's blinding and poisoning, she offered a comprehensive confession. It detailed the whereabouts of crucial evidence and named other individuals involved in the breeding program that spanned the area. Her confession, penned in a surprisingly articulate style that caught the investigators off guard. They had anticipated the ramblings of an uneducated farm worker, detailed years of methodical baby killings, all masked as legitimate scientific inquiry. Nancy's account was chillingly specific. She detailed the methods employed to kill infants, the sites where their remains were hidden, and the intricate web of communication that linked the experimental plantations scattered across Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. Virginia's officials were suddenly confronted with a predicament that upended their entire understanding of justice, the law, and the very fabric of society. Nancy's actions, a series of assaults, and an attempted murder, would typically lead to an immediate death sentence in Virginia. However, the actions of her victims were shocking, even by the standards of pre-Civil War Virginia, a place where violence against enslaved people was common and rarely punished. The systematic killing of infants, including those born into slavery, violated both legal and ethical standards that most Virginians, regardless of their views on slavery and racial hierarchy, found unacceptable. The use of enslaved people in scientific experiments crossed ethical boundaries, even for those who supported slavery. This was especially true when the research involved intentionally killing children. The political aspects of the case were more problematic, as they threatened to expose Confederate sympathizers and government officials who had supported or funded the research. Nancy's preserved evidence pointed to a web of experimental facilities spanning several states and implicated numerous influential families. This network operated with the complicity and backing of individuals who would soon be at the helm of the Confederate government. The Harwick family's demise, a slow, agonizing unraveling, unfolded over 6 days. Dr. Cartwright and his colleagues, horrified by the circumstances, worked tirelessly to treat them, even as the reality of the situation sank in. The plant-based poisons Nancy used were specifically designed to be deadly and resistant to treatment. This made medical help mostly useless, even with the best medical knowledge of 1,853. Dr. Edmund Harwick was the first to go. His body, a casualty of multiple organ failures, betrayed the agony within. His eyes, ruined, wept, a grotesque mixture of blood and pus, leaving crimson and yellow stains on his pillows and sheets. His last moments were a fevered haze, a cacophony of names echoing in his mind. He cried out for the children he'd taken, pleading for absolution from those who were long gone. His last words, as noted by Dr. Cartwright in a report that would stay secret for more than 100 years, were a confession. He admitted his wrongdoings and conceded that Nancy's actions were warranted. She did what any mother would do. He managed, his words, a struggle, barely audible through the bruising. God forgive us for what we did in the pursuit of knowledge. The children, those poor, innocent children, they deserve so much more than what we offered. The remaining family members succumbed in the days that followed. Each passing was a more excruciating ordeal than the one before, as the poison methodically dismantled their insides. They were aware, fully conscious of the horror unfolding within them. Thomas and William, just boys, spent their last moments calling for their mother. She was in the next room, succumbing to the same poison that was now taking them. Their voices, once strong, grew fainter as the toxin coursed through their veins. Margaret, the youngest, held on the longest, her youth a surprising ally as she battled the poison coursing through her. She witnessed the full extent of her family's gradual decline. Her last utterance was a desperate request for Nancy to show mercy, a stark acknowledgement that the woman who had been enslaved now wielded the ultimate authority over the lives of those who had once claimed ownership. Colonel Jeremiah Harwick, the old man who'd financed the breeding program, drifted through his last days in a haze of confusion. He barked commands at phantoms of soldiers long gone, replaying the War of 1,812 inches his mind, even as the poison coursed through him, shutting down his body. Captain James Harwick, the man who'd run the breeding program, passed away, his last words a curse upon Nancy, though he admitted, even then, that he'd gotten what he deserved. Mrs. Cordelia Harwick lingered, one of the final casualties, her noble lineage seemingly extending her agony. As she passed, she witnessed the utter collapse of everything she'd held true regarding racial superiority and the established social structure. In her last moments, she summoned Nancy to her side, pleading for absolution regarding her family's misdeeds. It was uncertain if this was a true expression of remorse or merely a reaction to the prospect of facing a higher power. Nancy observed the deaths from her cell within the research facility. She cradled her daughter, awaiting her own execution, and felt a tangled web of emotions, satisfaction, sorrow, and a grim resolve. She'd done it all. The Harwick family's own pain was a mere shadow of the anguish they'd caused. The proof of their misdeeds was meticulously recorded, and the breeding program, once hidden, was now laid bare, revealing its true monstrosity. Virginia officials, in the end, concluded that a public trial would be politically perilous. They also feared it would likely reveal the extensive web of experimental plantations that existed across the southern states. The systematic killing of enslaved children was already a difficult thing to justify. However, the involvement of important families and government officials in scientific experiments made the situation politically unstable, which could threaten the stability of the entire social order. They decided, instead, to move Nancy to a secluded location. There, she could be kept out of sight, away from the prying eyes of abolitionists and reporters. The goal was to prevent anyone from using her situation to criticize slavery or to reveal the existence of the breeding programs. The official story would claim she passed away from natural causes while in custody. The reality, however, was a tangled web of complexities and ethical gray areas. Nancy, however, had seen this coming. She'd anticipated it. And just as she'd meticulously plotted her revenge against the Harwick family, she'd prepared for this. Before she was moved, she'd managed to slip her meticulously crafted letters to Underground Railroad conductors. These individuals then saw to it that the letters reached well-known abolitionists in the North and even in Canada. Within weeks of her vanishing from Virginia, abolitionist newspapers across New England were running detailed exposés on the Harwick breeding program. These articles included excerpts from Dr. Daughter Zay's, Harwick's own journals, alongside testimony from enslaved individuals who had endured the experiments. The immediate political consequences were damaging for those who supported the Confederacy. They had hoped to use scientific racism to justify their actions and gain support for secession from more moderate Northerners. The revelation of the Harwick breeding program rippled through the clandestine network of experimental plantations, all operating under the radar in the South. Collaborators, suddenly aware their actions were now exposed to the public, felt the impact. Dr. Samuel Cartwright, confronted with the undeniable proof of the systematic infanticide his ideas had both inspired and rationalized, completely lost his grip on reality. He spent his last years in an asylum near Richmond, consumed by visions of the murdered children and the awful retribution Nancy Greene had exacted. As the scandal spread through Southern society, the other collaborators in the breeding program faced different outcomes. A few sought refuge in the far reaches of Texas or Arkansas, believing they could evade the political storm stirred up by Nancy's disclosures and carry on their activities with less scrutiny. Some tried to cover their tracks, incinerating documents and silencing anyone who might have seen something, all in a frantic bid to escape the same grim end that had claimed the Harwicks. Nancy's careful record-keeping, however, had kept a tight grip on the details, allowing her to pinpoint the majority of those involved in the network. Furthermore, her clever arrangement of the evidence meant that investigators could still follow the links between different locations, even if some of the individual records had vanished. Because her planning was systematic, the discovery of one facility inevitably led to the discovery of others. This started a chain reaction of revelations, ultimately resulting in the collapse of the entire network. The plantation fell silent right after the Harwick family perished. The locals, appalled by what they'd learned about the breeding program, wouldn't touch the land. They wouldn't work it, and they certainly wouldn't buy it. Within a few months, the main house was a shell, picked clean by thieves who seemed indifferent to the pain that had unfolded within its walls. The research facility, meanwhile, was reduced to ashes, consumed by flames set by those who wanted to erase any trace of the experiments. The Virginia State Archives, even with political pressure to bury the details of Nancy's story, managed to keep enough records. These documents now offer historians a comprehensive look at both the breeding program and the calculated retribution that followed. These long classified documents, now accessible to researchers, paint a comprehensive picture of the scientific racism that flourished before the Civil War. They also shed light on the lengths to which some enslaved individuals went to shield their loved ones and bring the truth to light. Nancy Greene's tale, a hushed legend, circulated among the enslaved people of the South. It was shared orally, a secret kept from the watchful eyes of those who owned them, who would have done anything to silence it. The story of a woman who single-handedly destroyed a family of slaveholders served as both a source of inspiration and a warning. It inspired those who wanted to resist and seek justice, while also showing the terrible costs that such resistance inevitably brought to those who tried it. Nancy's actions had a significant impact on the political landscape, reaching far beyond Virginia. This contributed significantly to the growing tensions between the North and the South, which eventually led to the Civil War. The discovery that those sympathetic to the Confederacy were running organized experiments on enslaved individuals, even going so far as to kill children, gave Northern politicians a potent weapon in their fight against the spread of slavery into new lands. The horrifying nature of the breeding programs strengthened the North's opposition to slavery. This made it impossible for moderate politicians to see the institution as a harmless economic system that could be gradually improved. The evidence of systematic infanticide showed that slavery inevitably led to the complete dehumanization of enslaved people, which then created situations that civilized society could not tolerate. Scholars examining the classified records concerning Nancy's situation have come to view her as a remarkably impactful individual in the context of American slavery's resistance efforts. Her methodical pursuit of vengeance, her meticulous documentation of proof, and her effective dismantling of the breeding program network showcased a degree of strategic acumen and operational proficiency that was unparalleled among enslaved individuals during her time. Nancy's ability to use the tools of scientific racism against those who created them showed that enslaved people had the intelligence and abilities that racist ideas claimed they didn't have. Her ability to read and write, her knowledge of chemistry and botany, and her skill in planning and carrying out a complex campaign for justice went against the common beliefs of slaveholders about the intellectual abilities of African Americans. However, the most significant aspect of Nancy's legacy was probably her success in protecting her daughter and ensuring the survival of her family, despite the systematic attempts to eliminate them through the breeding program. The child, marked for death by Dr. Harwick's cruel assessment, defied the odds. They lived and eventually became a teacher and activist. Their life's work centered on educating former slaves and safeguarding the narratives of those who had perished in the struggle for liberty. Nancy Green vanished without a trace, following her move from Harwick Plantation, and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance were never disclosed in any official capacity. Rumors swirl that her death was a covert operation, a move to silence her before she could reveal the details of the breeding program and implicate others. Some say she was moved to a psychiatric hospital, condemned to a life of seclusion. There, she withered away, a slow death brought on by the mental scars of her past and the things she had been made to endure. However, the Underground Railroad's network, along with the oral histories of those who fled, tell a different tale. These accounts hint that Nancy might have slipped away during her move, eventually reaching Canada. There, she supposedly found her daughter and lived the rest of her life as a free woman. These tales, unprovable yet beloved by their tellers, recount a woman's unwavering resolve. She wouldn't allow her sacrifice to be forgotten, and she battled for justice right up until the end. This enigma highlights that the suffering caused by American slavery went far beyond the economic exploitation that is usually recognized. The systematic dehumanization of enslaved people created conditions that allowed for terrible acts that would have been unthinkable in other situations. Moreover, the pseudo-scientific ideas used to justify these acts were often more horrifying than the institution of slavery itself. The story of Nancy Green illustrates the many ways people resisted, showing that even in difficult situations, individuals could find ways to fight against injustice and protect their loved ones. Her methodical approach to revenge, along with her success in revealing the truth about the breeding programs, demonstrates that enslaved people possessed both agency and intelligence, qualities that their oppressors refused to acknowledge.